Chapter 1. The Intensity of Psychic States. Can there be quantitative differences in conscious states? It is usually admitted that states of consciousness, sensations, feelings, passions, efforts, are capable of growth and diminution. We are even told that a sensation can be said to be twice, thrice, 4 times as intense as another sensation of the same kind. This latter thesis, which is maintained by psychophysicists, we shall examine later, but even the opponents of psychophysics do not see any harm in speaking of one sensation as being more intense than another, of one effort as being greater than another, and in thus setting up differences of quantity between purely internal states. Common sense, moreover, has not the slightest hesitation in giving its verdict on this point. People say they are more or less warm, more or less sad, and this distinction of more and less, even when it is carried over to the region of subjective facts and unextended objects, surprises nobody. But this involves a very obscure point and a much more important problem than is usually supposed. When we assert that one number is greater than another number, or one body greater than another body, we know very well what we mean. Such differences applicable to magnitudes, but not to intensities. For in both cases we allude to unequal spaces, as shall be shown in detail a little further on, and we call that space the greater which contains the other. But how can a more intense sensation contain one of less intensity? Shall we say that the first implies the second, that we reach the sensation of higher intensity only on condition of having first passed through the less intense stages of the same sensation, and that in a certain sense we are concerned here also with the relation of container to contained? This conception of intensive magnitude seems indeed to be that of common sense, but we cannot advance it as a philosophical explanation without becoming involved in a vicious circle. For it is beyond doubt that, in the natural series of numbers, the later number exceeds the earlier, but the very possibility of arranging the numbers in ascending order arises from their having to each other relations of container and contained, so that we feel ourselves able to explain precisely in what sense one is greater than the other. The question then is how we succeed in forming a series of this kind with intensities, which cannot be superposed on each other, and by what design we recognize that the members of this series increase, for example, instead of diminishing. But this always comes back to the inquiry why an intensity can be assimilated to a magnitude. Alleged distinction between two kinds of quantity, extensive and intensive magnitude. It is only to evade the difficulty to distinguish, as is usually done, between two species of quantity, the first extensive and measurable, the second intensive and not admitting of measure, but of which it can nevertheless be said that it is greater or less than another intensity. For it is recognized thereby that there is something common to these two forms of magnitude, since they are both termed magnitudes and declared to be equally capable of increase and diminution. But from the point of view of magnitude, what can there be in common between the extensive and the intensive, the extended and the unextended, if, in the first case, we call that which contains the other the greater quantity? Why go on speaking of quantity and magnitude when there is no longer a container or a contained? If a quantity can increase and diminish, if we can perceive it, so to speak, the less inside the more, is not such a quantity on this very account divisible and thereby extended? Is it not then a contradiction to speak of an inextensive quantity? But yet, common sense agrees with the philosophers in setting up a pure intensity as a magnitude, just as if it were something extended. And not only do we use the same word, but whether we think of a greater intensity or a greater extensity, we experience in both cases an analogous impression. The terms greater and less call up in both cases the same idea. If we now ask ourselves, in what does this idea consist? Our consciousness still offers the image of a container and a contained. We picture to ourselves, for example, a greater intensity of effort as a greater length of thread rolled up, or as a spring which, in unwinding, will occupy a greater space. In the idea of intensity, and even in the word which expresses it, we shall find the image of a present contradiction and consequently a future expansion, the image of something virtually extended, and if we may say so, of a compressed space. We are thus led to believe that we translate the intensive into the extensive, and that we compare two intensities, or at least express the comparison by the confused intuition of a relation between two extensities. But it is just the nature of this operation which it is difficult to determine. Attempt to distinguish intensities by objective causes, but we judge of intensity without knowing magnitude or nature of the cause. The solution which occurs immediately to the mind once it has entered upon this path consists in defining the intensity of a sensation, or of any state whatever of the ego, by the number and magnitude of the objective, and therefore measurable causes which have given rise to it. Doubtless, a more intense sensation of light is the one which has been obtained, or is obtainable, by means of a larger number of luminous sources, provided they be at the same distance and identical with one another. But, in the immense majority of cases, we decide about the intensity of the effect without even knowing the nature of the cause, much less its magnitude. Indeed, it is the very intensity of the effect which often leads us to venture an hypothesis as to the number and nature of the causes, and thus to revise the judgment of our senses, which at first represented them as insignificant. And it is no use arguing that we are then comparing the actual state of the ego with some previous state in which the cause was perceived in its entirety at the same time as its effect was experienced. No doubt this is our procedure in a fairly large number of cases, but we cannot then explain the differences of intensity which we recognize between deep-seated psychic phenomena, the cause of which is within us and not outside. On the other hand, we are never so bold in judging the intensity of a psychic state as when the subjective aspect of the phenomenon is the only one to strike us, or when the external cause to which we refer it does not easily admit of measurement. Thus, it seems evident that we experience a more intense pain at the pulling out of a tooth than of a hair. The artist knows, without the possibility of a doubt, that the picture of a master affords him more intense pleasure than the signboard of a shop, and there is not the slightest need ever to have heard of forces of cohesion to assert that we expend less effort in bending a steel blade than a bar of iron. Thus, the comparison of two intensities is usually made without the least appreciation of the number of causes, their mode of action, or their extent. Attempt to distinguish intensities by atomic movements, but it is the sensation which is given in consciousness, and not the movement. There is still room, it is true, for an hypothesis of the same nature, but more subtle. We know that mechanical and especially kinetic theories aim at explaining the visible and sensible properties of bodies by well-defined movements of their ultimate parts, and many of us foresee the time when the intensive differences of qualities, that is to say, of our sensations, will be reduced to extensive differences between the changes taking place behind them. May it not be maintained that, without knowing these theories, we have a vague surmise of them, that behind the more intense sound we guess the presence of ampler vibrations which are propagated in the disturbed medium, and that it is with a reference to this mathematical relation, precise in itself though confusedly perceived, that we assert the higher intensity of a particular sound. Without even going so far, could it not be laid down that every state of consciousness corresponds to a certain disturbance of the molecules and atoms of the cerebral substance, and that the intensity of a sensation measures the amplitude, the complication, or the extent of these molecular movements? This last hypothesis is at least as probable as the other, but it no more solves the problem. For quite possibly the intensity of a sensation bears witness to a more or less considerable work accomplished in our organism, but it is the sensation which is given to us in consciousness, and not this mechanical work. Indeed, it is by the intensity of the sensation that we judge of the greater or less amount of work accomplished. Intensity then remains, at least apparently, a property of sensation. And still the same question recurs. Why do we say of a higher intensity that it is greater? Why do we think of a greater quantity or a greater space? Side note: different kinds of intensities. 1. Deep-seated psychic states. 2. Muscular effort. Intensity is more easily definable in the former case. Perhaps the difficulty of the problem lies chiefly in the fact that we call by the same name and picture to ourselves in the same way intensities which are very different in nature, e.g., the intensity of a feeling and that of a sensation or an effort. The effort is accompanied by a muscular sensation, and the sensations themselves are connected with certain physical conditions which probably count for something in the estimate of their intensity. We have here to do with phenomena which take place on the surface of consciousness, and which are always connected, as we shall see further on, with the perception of a movement or of an external object. But certain states of the soul seem to us, rightly or wrongly, to be self-sufficient, such as deep joy or sorrow, a reflective passion, or an aesthetic emotion. Pure intensity ought to be more easily definable in these simple cases, where no extensive element seems to be involved. We shall see, in fact, that it is reducible here to a certain quality or shade which spreads over a more or less considerable mass of psychic states, or, if the expression be preferred, to the larger or smaller number of simple states which make up the fundamental emotion. Take, for example, the progress of a desire. For example, an obscure desire gradually becomes a deep passion. Now, you will see that the feeble intensity of this desire consisted at first in its appearing to be isolated and, as it were, foreign to the remainder of your inner life. But little by little it permeates a larger number of psychic elements, tinging them, so to speak, with its own color, and lo, your outlook on the whole of your surroundings seems now to have changed radically. How do you become aware of a deep passion once it has taken hold of you, if not by perceiving that the same objects no longer impress you in the same manner? All your sensations and all your ideas seem to brighten up. It is like childhood back again. We experience something of the kind in certain dreams, in which we do not imagine anything out of the ordinary, and yet through which there resounds an indescribable note of originality. The fact is that the further we penetrate into the depths of consciousness, the less right we have to treat psychic phenomena as things which are set side by side. When it is said that an object occupies a large space in the soul, or even that it fills it entirely, we ought to understand by this simply that its image has altered the shade of 1,000 perceptions or memories. We ought to understand by this simply that its image has altered the shade of 1,000 perceptions or memories, and that in this sense it pervades them, although it does not itself come into view. But this wholly dynamic way of looking at things is repugnant to their reflective consciousness, because the latter delights in clean-cut distinctions which are easily expressed in words and in things with well-defined outlines, like those which are perceived in space. It will assume, then, that everything else remaining identical, such and such a desire has gone up a scale of magnitudes, as though it were permissible still to speak of magnitude where there is neither multiplicity nor space. But just as consciousness, as will be shown later, concentrates on a given point of the organism, the increasing number of muscular contractions will take place on the surface of the body, thus converting them into one single feeling of effort, of growing intensity, so it will hypostatize under the form of a growing desire the gradual alterations which take place in the confused heap of coexisting psychic states. But that is a change of quality rather than of magnitude. What makes hope such an intense pleasure is the fact that the future, which we dispose of to our liking, appears to us at the same time under a multitude of forms, equally attractive and equally possible. Even if the most coveted of these becomes realized, it will be necessary to give up the others, and we shall have lost a great deal. The idea of the future, pregnant with an infinity of possibilities, is thus more fruitful than the future itself, and this is why we find more charm in hope than in possession, in dreams than in reality. The emotions of joy and sorrow, their successive stages, correspond to qualitative changes in the whole of our psychic states. Let us try and discover the nature of an increasing intensity of joy or sorrow in the exceptional cases where no physical symptom intervenes. Neither inner joy nor passion is an isolated inner state which at first occupies a corner of the soul and gradually spreads. At its lower level, it is very like a tuning of our states of consciousness towards the future. Then, as if their weight were diminished by this attraction, our ideas and sensations succeed one another with great rapidity. Our movements no longer cost us the same effort. Finally, in cases of extreme joy, our perceptions and memories become tinged with an indefinable quality, as with a kind of heat or light, so novel that now and then, as we stare at our own self, we wonder how it can really exist. Thus, there are several characteristic forms of purely inward joy, all of which are successive stages corresponding to qualitative alterations in the whole of our psychic states. But the number of states which are concerned with each of these alterations is more or less considerable, and, without explicitly counting them, we know very well whether, for example, our joy pervades all the impressions which we receive in the course of the day, or whether any escape from its influence. We thus set up points of division in the interval which separates two successive forms of joy, and this gradual transition from one to the other makes them appear in their turn as different intensities of one and the same feeling, which is thus supposed to change in magnitude. It could be easily shown that the different degrees of sorrow also correspond to qualitative changes. Sorrow begins by being nothing more than a facing towards the past, an impoverishment of our sensations and ideas, as if each of them were now contained entirely in the little which it gives out, as if the future were in some way stopped up, and it ends with an impression of crushing failure, the effect of which is that we aspire to nothingness, while every new misfortune, by making us understand better the uselessness of the struggle, causes us a bitter pleasure. The aesthetic feelings, their increasing intensities, are really different feelings. The aesthetic feelings offer us a still more striking example of this progressive stepping in of new elements, which can be detected in the fundamental emotion and which seem to increase its magnitude, although in reality they do nothing more than alter its nature. Let us consider the simplest of them, the feeling of grace. At first, it is only the perception of a certain ease, a certain facility in the outward movements. And as those movements are easy which prepare the way for others, we are led to find a superior ease in the movements which can be foreseen in the present attitudes in which future attitudes are pointed out and, as it were, prefigured. If jerky movements are wanting in grace, the reason is that each of them is self-sufficient and does not announce those which are to follow. If curves are more graceful than broken lines, the reason is that while a curved line changes its direction at every moment, every new direction is indicated in the preceding one. Thus the perception of ease in motion passes over into the pleasure of mastering the flow of time and of holding the future in the present. A third element comes in when the graceful movements submit to a rhythm and are accompanied by music. For the rhythm and measure, by allowing us to foresee to a still greater extent the movements of the dancer, make us believe that we now control them. As we guess almost the exact attitude which the dancer is going to take, he seems to obey us when he really takes it. The regularity of the rhythm establishes a kind of communication between him and us, and the periodic returns of the measure are like so many invisible threads by means of which we set in motion this imaginary puppet. Indeed, if it stops for an instant, our hand in its impatience cannot refrain from making a movement, as though to push it, as though to replace it in the midst of this movement, the rhythm of which has taken complete possession of our thought and will. Thus a kind of physical sympathy enters into the feeling of grace. Now, in analyzing the charm of this sympathy, you will find that it pleases you through its affinity with moral sympathy, the idea of which it subtly suggests. This last element, in which the others are merged, after having in a measure ushered it in, explains the irresistible attractiveness of grace. We could hardly make out why it affords us such pleasure if it were nothing but a saving of effort, as Spencer maintains. But the truth is that in anything which we call very graceful, we imagine ourselves able to detect, besides the lightness which is a sign of mobility, some suggestion of a possible movement towards ourselves, of a virtual and even nascent sympathy. It is this mobile sympathy, always ready to offer itself, which is just the essence of higher grace. Thus, the increasing intensities of aesthetic feeling are here resolved into as many different feelings, each one of which, already heralded by its predecessor, becomes perceptible in it and then completely eclipses it. It is this qualitative progress which we interpret as a change of magnitude, because we like simple thoughts and because our language is ill-suited to render the subtleties of psychological analysis. The feeling of beauty. Art puts to sleep our active and resistant powers and makes us responsive to suggestion. To understand how the feeling of the beautiful itself admits of degrees, we should have to submit it to a minute analysis. Perhaps the difficulty which we experience in defining it is largely owing to the fact that we look upon the beauties of nature as anterior to those of art. The processes of art are thus supposed to be nothing more than means by which the artist expresses the beautiful, and the essence of the beautiful remains unexplained. But we might ask ourselves whether nature is beautiful otherwise than through meeting by chance certain processes of our art, and whether, in a certain sense, art is not prior to nature. Without even going so far, it seems more in conformity with the rules of a sound method to study the beautiful first in the works in which it has been produced by a conscious effort, and then to pass on by imperceptible steps from art to nature, which may be looked upon as an artist in its own way. By placing ourselves at this point of view, we shall perceive that the object of art is to put to sleep the active or rather resistant powers of our personality, and thus to bring us into a state of perfect responsiveness, in which we realize the idea that is suggested to us and sympathize with the feeling that is expressed. In the processes of art, we shall find in a weakened form a refined and in some measure spiritualized version of the processes commonly used to induce the state of hypnosis. Thus, in music, the rhythm and measure suspend the normal flow of our sensations and ideas by causing our attention to swing to and fro between fixed points, and they take hold of us with such force that even the faintest imitation of a groan will suffice to fill us with the utmost sadness. If musical sounds affect us more powerfully than the sounds of nature, the reason is that nature confines itself to expressing feelings, whereas music suggests them to us. Whence, indeed, comes the charm of poetry. The poet is he with whom feelings develop into images, and the images themselves into words, which translate them while obeying the laws of rhythm. In seeing these images pass before our eyes, we in our turn experience the feeling which was, so to speak, their emotional equivalent. But we should never realize these images so strongly without the regular movements of the rhythm, by which our soul is lulled into self-forgetfulness, and, as in a dream, thinks and sees with the poet. The plastic arts obtain an effect of the same kind by the fixity which they suddenly impose upon life, and which a physical contagion carries over to the attention of the spectator. While the works of ancient sculpture express faint emotions which play upon them like a passing breath, the pale immobility of the stone causes the feeling expressed or the movement just begun to appear as if they were fixed forever, absorbing our thought and our will in their own eternity. We find in architecture, in the very midst of this startling immobility, certain effects analogous to those of rhythm. The symmetry of form, the indefinite repetition of the same architectural motive causes our faculty of perception to oscillate between the same and the same again, and gets rid of those customary, incessant changes which in ordinary life bring us back without ceasing to the consciousness of our personality. Even the faint suggestion of an idea will then be enough to make the idea fill the whole of our mind. Thus, art aims at impressing feelings on us rather than expressing them. It suggests them to us and willingly dispenses with the imitation of nature when it finds some more efficacious means. Nature, like art, proceeds by suggestion, but does not command the resources of rhythm. It supplies the deficiency by the long comradeship based on influences received in common by nature and by ourselves, of which the effect is that the slightest indication by nature of a feeling arouses sympathy in our minds, just as a mere gesture on the part of the hypnotist is enough to force the intended suggestion upon a subject accustomed to his control. And this sympathy is shown in particular when nature displays to us beings of normal proportions, so that our attention is distributed equally over all the parts of the figure without being fixed on any one of them. Our perceived faculty then finds itself lulled and soothed by this harmony, and nothing hinders any longer the free play of sympathy, which is ever ready to come forward as soon as the obstacle in its path is removed. Stages in the aesthetic emotion. It follows from this analysis that the feeling of the beautiful is no specific feeling, but that every feeling experienced by us will assume an aesthetic character, provided that it has been suggested and not caused. It will now be understood why the aesthetic emotion seems to us to admit of degrees of intensity and also of degrees of elevation. Sometimes the feeling which is suggested scarcely makes a break in the compact texture of psychic phenomena of which our history consists. Sometimes it draws our attention from them, but not so that they become lost to sight. Sometimes, finally, it puts itself in their place, engrosses us, and completely monopolizes our soul. There are thus distinct phases in the progress of an aesthetic feeling, as in the state of hypnosis, and these phases correspond less to variations of degree than to differences of state or of nature. But the merit of a work of art is not measured so much by the power with which the suggested feeling takes hold of us as by the richness of this feeling itself. In other words, besides degrees of intensity, we instinctively distinguish degrees of depth or elevation. If this last concept be analyzed, it will be seen that the feelings and thoughts which the artist suggests to us express and sum up a more or less considerable part of his history. If the art which gives us only sensation is an inferior art, the reason is that analysis often fails to discover in a sensation anything beyond the sensation itself, but the greater number of emotions are instinct with 1,000 sensations, feelings, or ideas which pervade them. Each one is then a state unique of its kind and indefinable, and it seems that we should have to relive the life of the subject who experiences it if we wished to grasp it in its original complexity. Yet the artist aims at giving us a share in this emotion, so rich, so personal, so novel, and at enabling us to experience what he cannot make us understand. This he will bring about by choosing, among the outward signs of his emotions, those which our body is likely to imitate mechanically, those slightly, as soon as it perceives them, so as to transport us all at once into the indefinable psychological state which called them forth. Thus will be broken the barrier interposed by time and space between his consciousness and ours, and the richer in ideas and the more pregnant with sensations and emotions is the feeling within whose limits the artist has brought us, the deeper and the higher shall we find the beauty thus expressed. The successive intensities of the aesthetic feeling thus correspond to changes of state occurring in us, and the degrees of depth to the larger or smaller number of elementary psychic phenomena which we dimly discern in the fundamental emotion. The moral feelings, pity, its increasing intensity is a qualitative progress. The moral feelings might be studied in the same way. Let us take pity as an example. It consists in the first place in putting oneself mentally in the place of others, in suffering their pain. But if we were nothing more, as some have maintained, it would inspire us with the idea of avoiding the wretched rather than helping them, for pain is naturally abhorrent to us. This feeling of horror may indeed be at the root of pity, but a new element soon comes in, the need of helping our fellow men and of alleviating their suffering. Shall we say with La Rochefoucauld that this so-called sympathy is a calculation, a shrewd insurance against evils to come? Perhaps a dread of some future evil to ourselves does hold a place in our compassion for other people's evil. These, however, are but lower forms of pity. True pity consists not so much in fearing suffering as in desiring it. The desire is a faint one, and we should hardly wish to see it realized. Yet we form it in spite of ourselves, as if nature were committing some great injustice, and it were necessary to get rid of all suspicion of complicity with her. The essence of pity is thus a need for self-abasement, an inspiration downwards. This painful aspiration, nevertheless, has a charm about it, because it raises us in our own estimation and makes us feel superior to those sensuous goods from which our thought is temporarily detached. The increasing intensity of pity thus consists in a qualitative progress, in a transition from repugnance to fear, from fear to sympathy, and from sympathy itself to humility. Conscious states connected with external causes or involving psychical symptoms. We do not propose to carry this analysis any further. The psychic states whose intensity we have just defined are deep-seated states which do not seem to have any close relation to their external cause, or to involve the perception of muscular contraction. But such states are rare. There is hardly any passion or desire, any joy or sorrow which is not accompanied by physical symptoms. And where these symptoms occur, they probably count for something in the estimate of intensities. As for the sensations properly called, they are manifestly connected with their external cause. And though the intensity of the sensation cannot be defined by the magnitude of its cause, there undoubtedly exists some relation between these two terms. In some of its manifestations, consciousness even appears to spread outwards, as if intensity were being developed into extensity, e.g., in the case of muscular effort. Let us face this last phenomenon at once. We shall thus be transported at a bound to the opposite extremity of the series of psychic phenomena. Muscular effort seems at first sight to be quantitative. If there is a phenomenon which seems to be presented immediately to consciousness under the form of quantity or at least of magnitude, it is undoubtedly muscular effort. We picture to our minds a psychic force imprisoned in the soul like the winds in the cave of Aeolus, and only waiting for an opportunity to burst forth. Our will is supposed to watch over this force and from time to time open a passage for it, regulating the outflow by the effect which it is desired to produce. If we consider the matter carefully, we shall see that this somewhat crude conception of effort plays a large part in our belief in intensive magnitudes. Muscular force, whose sphere of action is space and which manifests itself in phenomena admitting of measure, seems to us to have existed previous to its manifestations, but in smaller volume and, so to speak, in a compressed state. Hence, we do not hesitate to reduce this volume more and more. And finally, we believe that we can understand how a purely psychic state, which does not occupy space, can nevertheless possess magnitude. Science, too, tends to strengthen the illusion of common sense with regard to this point. Bain, for example, declares that the sensibility accompanying muscular movement coincides with the outgoing stream of nervous energy. It is thus just the emission of nervous force which consciousness perceives. Wundt also speaks of a sensation central in its origin, accompanying the voluntary innervation of the muscles, and quotes the example of the paralytic who has a very distinct sensation of the force which he employs in the effort to raise his leg, although it remains motionless. Most of the authorities adhere to this opinion, which would be the unanimous view of positive science, were it not that several years ago Professor William James drew the attention of physiologists to certain phenomena which had been but little remarked, although they were very remarkable. Feeling of effort. We are conscious not of an expenditure of force, but of the resulting muscular movement. When a paralytic strives to raise his useless limb, he certainly does not execute this movement, but with or without his will, he executes another. Some movement is carried out somewhere, otherwise there is no sensation or effort. Vulpian had already called attention to the fact that if a man affected with hemiplegia is told to clench his paralyzed fist, he unconsciously carries out this action with the fist which is not affected. Ferrier described a still more curious phenomenon. Stretch out your arm while slightly bending your forefinger, as if you were going to press the trigger of a pistol, without moving the finger, without contracting any muscle of the hand, without producing any apparent movement, you will yet be able to feel that you are expending energy. On a closer examination, however, you will perceive that this sensation of effort coincides with the fixation of the muscles of your chest, that you keep your glottis closed and actively contract your respiratory muscles. As soon as respiration resumes its normal course, the consciousness of effort vanishes, unless you really move your finger. These facts already seem to show that we are conscious, not of an expenditure of force, but of the movement of the muscles which results from it. The new feature in Professor James's investigation is that he has verified the hypothesis in the case of examples which seemed to contradict it absolutely. Thus, when the external rectus muscle of the right eye is paralyzed, the patient tries in vain to turn his eye towards the right, yet objects seem to him to recede towards the right, and since the act of volition has produced no effect, it follows, says Helmholtz, that he is conscious of the effort of volition. But, replies Professor James, no account has been taken of what goes on in the other eyes. This remains covered during the experiments. Nevertheless, it moves, and there is not much trouble in proving that it does. It is the movement of the left eye, perceived by consciousness, which produces the sensation of effort together with the impression that the objects perceived by the right eye are moving. These and similar observations lead Professor James to assert that the feeling of effort is centripetal and not centrifugal. We are not conscious of a force which we are supposed to launch upon our organism. Our feeling of muscular energy at work is a complex afferent sensation which comes from contracted muscles, stretched ligaments, compressed joints, an immobilized chest, a closed glottis, a knit brow, clenched jaws, in a word, from all the points of the periphery where the effort causes an alteration. Intensity of feeling of effort proportional to extent of our body affected. It is not for us to take a side in the dispute. After all, the question with which we have to deal is not whether the feeling of effort comes from the center or the periphery, but in what does our perception of its intensity exactly consist. Now, it is sufficient to observe oneself attentively to reach a conclusion on this point which Professor James has not formulated, but which seems to us quite in accord with the spirit of his teaching. We maintain that the more a given effort seems to us to increase, the greater is the number of muscles which contract in sympathy with it, and that the apparent consciousness of a greater intensity of effort at a given point of the organism is reducible, in reality, to the perception of a larger surface of the body being affected. Our consciousness of an increase of muscular effort consists in the perception of 1. A greater number of peripheral sensations, and 2. A qualitative change in some of them. Try, for example, to clench the fist with increasing force. You will have the impression of a sensation of effort entirely localized in your hand and running up a scale of magnitudes. In reality, what you experience in your hand remains the same, but the sensation which was at first localized there has affected your arm and ascended to the shoulder. Finally, the other arm stiffens. Both legs do the same. The respiration is checked. It is the whole body which is at work. But you fail to notice distinctly all these concomitant movements unless you are warned of them. Till then you thought you were dealing with a single state of consciousness which changed in magnitude. When you press your lips more and more tightly against one another, you believe that you are experiencing in your lips one and the same sensation, which is continually increasing in strength. Here again, further reflection will show you that this sensation remains identical, but that certain muscles of the face and the head and then of all the rest of the body have taken part in the operation. You felt this gradual encroachment, this increase of the surface affected, which is in truth a change of quantity, but as your attention was concentrated on your closed lips, you localized the increase there, and you made the psychic force there expanded into a magnitude, although it possessed no extensity. Examine carefully somebody who is lifting heavier and heavier weights. The muscular contraction gradually spreads over his whole body. As for the special sensation which he experiences in the arm which is at work, it remains constant for a very long time and hardly changes except in quality, the way becoming at a certain moment fatigue, and the fatigue pain. Yet the subject will imagine that he is conscious of a continual increase in the psychic force flowing into his arm. He will not recognize his mistake unless he is warned of it. So inclined is he to measure a given psychic state by the conscious movements which accompany it. From these facts and from many others of the same kind, we believe we can deduce the following conclusion. Our consciousness of an increase of muscular effort is reducible to the twofold perception of a greater number of peripheral sensations and of a qualitative change occurring in some of them. The same definition of intensity applies to superficial efforts, deep-seated feelings, and states intermediate between the two. We are thus led to define the intensity of a superficial effort in the same way as that of cases in which there is a qualitative progress and an increasing complexity indistinctly perceived. But consciousness, accustomed to think in terms of space and to translate its thoughts into words, will denote the feeling by a single word and will localize the effort at the exact point where it yields a useful result. It will then become aware of an effort which is always of the same nature and increases at the spot assigned to it, and a feeling which, retaining the same name, grows without changing its nature. Now, the same illusion of consciousness is likely to be met with again in the case of the states which are intermediate between superficial efforts and deep-seated feelings. A large number of psychic states are accompanied, in fact, by muscular contractions and peripheral sensations. Sometimes these superficial elements are coordinated by a purely speculative idea, sometimes by an idea of a practical order. In the first case, there is intellectual effort or attention. In the second, we have the emotions which may be called violent or acute, anger, terror, and certain varieties of joy, sorrow, passion, and desire. Let us show briefly that the same definition of intensity applies to these intermediate states. The intermediate states: attention and its relation to muscular contraction. Attention is not a purely physiological phenomenon, but we cannot deny that it is accompanied by movements. These movements are neither the cause nor the result of the phenomenon, they are part of it. They express it in terms of space, as Ribot has so remarkably proved. Fechner had already reduced the effort of attention in a sense organ to the muscular feeling produced by putting in motion by a sort of reflex action the muscles which are correlated with the different sense organs. He had noticed the very distinct sensation of tension and contraction of the scalp, the pressure from without inwards over the whole skull, which we experience when we make a great effort to recall something. Ribot has studied more closely the movements which are characteristic of voluntary attention. Attention contracts the frontal muscle. This muscle draws the eyebrow towards itself, raises it, and causes transverse wrinkles on the forehead. In extreme cases, the mouth is opened wide. With children and with many adults, eager attention gives rise to a protrusion of the lips, a kind of pout. Certainly, a purely psychic factor will always enter into voluntary attention, even if it be nothing more than the exclusion by the will of all ideas foreign to the one. with which the subject wishes to occupy himself. But once this exclusion is made, we believe that we are still conscious of a growing tension of soul, of an immaterial effort which increases. Analyze this impression and you will find nothing but the feeling of a muscular contraction, which spreads over a wider surface or changes its nature, so that the tension becomes pressure, fatigue, and pain. The intensity of violent emotions as muscular tension. Now, we do not see any essential difference between the effort of attention and what may be the intensity called the effort of psychic tension. Acute desire, uncontrolled anger, passionate love, violent hatred. Each of these states may be reduced, we believe, to a system of muscular contractions coordinated by an idea. But in the case of attention, it is the more or less reflective idea of knowing. In the case of emotion, the unreflective idea of acting. The intensity of these violent emotions is thus likely to be nothing but the muscular tension which accompanies them. Darwin has given a remarkable description of the physiological symptoms of rage. The action of the heart is much accelerated. The face reddens or may turn deadly pale. The respiration is labored, the chest heaves, and the dilated nostrils quiver. The whole body often trembles. The voice is affected. The teeth are clenched or ground together, and the muscular system is commonly stimulated to violent, almost frantic action. The gestures represent more or less plainly the act of striking or fighting with an enemy. We shall not go so far as to maintain with Professor James that the emotion of rage is reducible to the sum of these organic sensations. There will always be an irreducible psychic element in anger, if this be only the idea of striking or fighting, of which Darwin speaks, and which gives a common direction to so many diverse movements. But though this idea determines the direction of the emotional state and the accompanying movements, the growing intensity of the state itself is, we believe, nothing but the deeper and deeper disturbance of the organism, a disturbance which consciousness has no difficulty in measuring by the number and extent of the bodily surfaces concerned. It will be useless to assert that there is a restrained rage which is all the more intense. The reason is that where emotion has free play, consciousness does not dwell on the details of the accompanying movements, but it does dwell upon them and is concentrated upon them when its object is to conceal them, eliminate, in short, all trace of organic disturbance, all tendency towards muscular contraction, and all that will be left of anger will be the idea, or, if you still insist on making it an emotion, you will be unable to assign it any intensity. Intensity and reflex movements. No essential difference between intensity of deep-seated feelings and that of violent emotions. Fear, when strong, says Herbert Spencer, expresses itself in cries, in efforts to escape, in palpitations, in tremblings. We go further and maintain that these movements form part of the terror itself. By their means, the terror becomes an emotion capable of passing through different degrees of intensity. Suppress them entirely, and the more or less intense state of terror will be succeeded by an idea of terror, the wholly intellectual representation of a danger which it concerns us to avoid. There are also high degrees of joy and sorrow, of desire, aversion, and even shame, the height of which will be found to be nothing but the reflex movements begun by the organism and perceived by consciousness. When lovers meet, says Darwin, we know that their hearts beat quickly, their breathing is hurried, and their faces flushed. Aversion is marked by movements of repugnance which we repeat without noticing when we think of the object of our dislike. We blush and involuntarily clench the fingers when we feel shame, even if it be retrospective. The acuteness of these emotions is estimated by the number and nature of the peripheral sensations which accompany them. Little by little, and in proportion as the emotional state loses its violence and gains in depth, the peripheral sensations will give place to inner states. It will be no longer our outward movements, but our ideas, our memories, our states of consciousness of every description, which will turn in larger or smaller numbers in a definite direction. There is, then, no essential difference from the point of view of intensity between the deep-seated feelings of which we spoke at the beginning and the acute or violent emotions which we have just passed in review. To say that love, hatred, desire increase in violence is to assert that they are projected outwards, that they radiate to the surface, that peripheral sensations are substituted for inner states. But superficial or deep-seated, violent or reflective, the intensity of these feelings always consists in the multiplicity of simple states which consciousness dimly discerns in them. Magnitude of sensations, affective and representative sensations. We have hitherto confined ourselves to feelings and efforts, complex states the intensity of which does not absolutely depend on an external cause. But sensations seem to us simple states. In what will their magnitude consist? The intensity of sensations varies with the external cause of which they are said to be the conscious equivalent. How shall we explain the presence of quantity in an effect which is inextensive and in this case indivisible? To answer this question, we must first distinguish between the so-called affective and the representative sensations. There is no doubt that we pass gradually from one to the other, and that some affective element enters into the majority of our simple representations, but nothing prevents us from isolating this element and inquiring separately in what does the intensity of an affective sensation, a pleasure or a pain, consist. Affective sensations and organic disturbance. Perhaps the difficulty of the latter problem is principally due to the fact that we are unwilling to see in the affective state anything but the conscious expression of an organic disturbance, the inward echo of an outward cause. We notice that a more intense sensation generally corresponds to a greater nervous disturbance, but inasmuch as these disturbances are unconscious as movements, since they come before consciousness in the guise of sensation which has no resemblance at all to motion, we do not see how they could transmit to the sensation anything of their own magnitude. For there is nothing in common, we repeat, between superposable magnitudes, such as, for example, vibration amplitudes, and sensations which do not occupy space. If the more intense sensation seems to us to contain the less intense, if it assumes for us, like the physical impression itself, the form of a magnitude, the reason probably is that it retains something of the physical impression to which it corresponds, and it will retain nothing of it if it is merely the conscious translation of a movement of molecules. For just because this movement is translated into the sensation of pleasure or pain, it remains unconscious as molecular movement. Pleasure and pain as signs of the future reaction rather than psychic translations of the past stimulus. But it might be asked whether pleasure and pain, instead of expressing only what has just occurred or what is actually occurring in the organism, is, as usually believed, could not also point out what is going to or what is tending to take place. It seems indeed somewhat improbable that nature, so profoundly utilitarian, should have here assigned to consciousness the merely scientific task of informing us about the past or the present, which no longer depend upon us. It must be noticed in addition that we rise by imperceptible stages from automatic to free movements, and that the latter differ from the former principally in introducing an affective sensation between the external action which occasions them and the volitional reaction which ensues. Indeed, all our actions might have been automatic, and we can surmise that there are many organized beings in whose case an external stimulus causes a definite reaction without calling up consciousness as an intermediate agent. If pleasure and pain make their appearance in certain privileged beings, it is probably to call forth a resistance to the automatic reaction which would have taken place. Either sensation has nothing to do, or it is nascent freedom. But how would it enable us to resist the reaction which is in preparation if it did not acquaint us with the nature of the latter by some definite sign? And what can this sign be except the sketching and, as it were, the prefiguring of the future automatic movement in the very midst of the sensation which is being experienced? The affective state must then correspond not merely to the physical disturbances, movements, or phenomena which have taken place, but also and especially to those which are in preparation, those which are getting ready to be. Intensity of affective sensations would then be our consciousness of the involuntary movements tending to follow the stimulus. It is certainly not obvious at first sight how this hypothesis simplifies the problem, for we are trying to find what there can be in common from the point of view of magnitude between a physical phenomenon and a state of consciousness, and we seem to have merely turned the difficulty round by making the present state of consciousness a sign of the future reaction, rather than a psychic translation of the past stimulus. But the difference between the two hypotheses is considerable, for the molecular disturbances which were mentioned just now are necessarily unconscious, since no trace of the movements themselves can be actually perceived in the sensation which translates them. But the automatic movements which tend to follow the stimulus as its natural outcome are likely to be conscious as movements, or else the sensation itself, whose function is to invite us to choose between this automatic reaction and other possible movements, would be of no avail. The intensity of affective sensations might thus be nothing more than our consciousness of the involuntary movements which are being begun and outlined, so to speak, within these states, and which would have gone on in their own way if nature had made us automata instead of conscious beings. Intensity of a pain estimated by extent of organism affected. If such be the case, we shall not compare a pain of increasing intensity to a note which grows louder and louder, but rather to a symphony in which an increasing number of instruments make themselves heard. Within the characteristic sensation which gives the tone to all the others, consciousness distinguishes a larger or smaller number of sensations arising at different points of the periphery, muscular contractions, organic movements of every kind. The choir of these elementary psychic states voices new demands of the organism when confronted by a new situation. In other words, we estimate the intensity of a pain by the larger or smaller part of the organism which takes interest in it. Richet has observed that the slighter the pain, the more precisely it is referred to a particular spot. If it becomes more intense, it is referred to the whole of the member affected, and he concludes by saying that the pain spreads in proportion as it is more intense. We should rather reverse the sentence, and define the intensity of the pain by the very number and extent of the parts of the body which sympathize with it and react, and whose reactions are perceived by consciousness. To convince ourselves of this, it will be enough to read the remarkable description of disgust given by the same author. If the stimulus is slight, there may be neither nausea nor vomiting. If the stimulus is stronger, instead of being confined to the pneumogastric nerve, it spreads and affects almost the whole organic system. The face turns pale, the smooth muscles of the skin contract, the skin is covered with a cold perspiration, the heart stops beating. In a word, there is a general organic disturbance following the stimulation of the medulla oblongata, and this disturbance is the supreme expression of disgust. But is it nothing more than its expression?